All right, guys, come on in. All right, sorry I'm a minute late here. We'll just gonna wait just a minute. Hopefully we get a couple more people attending. And I'll just get a couple of things I wanted to just quickly do here. Figure out what I'm doing. Okay. Oh, we're up to, oh, this should have been mid-all. Sorry, guys. Thought I opened this up so we didn't have to do that. There we go. Okay. Got 7 of you. Remember back in the days where 21 or 22 of you would join class? Oh, those were the days. All right. Today we start on the female reproductive system. So a couple of things to share with you first. I'm just going to quickly just say what I have here. All right, is your nervous system unit exam is posted. It's been posted since noon on Friday. The deadline for that is noon tomorrow. So get that done, please, as soon as you can. So that's for the nervous system. And then there's one more unit exam after that. That's reproduction. And then we are done. So November 18th is when my marks are due. Not November, whoops, just been corrected by the peanut gallery. Our marks are due on June 18th for diploma courses. So my last day to accept stuff from you is the 16th, with the exception of maybe some stuff for the reproductive system, but I'll let you know if those dates change. Otherwise, just assume it's the 16th for everything. Oh, I'm up to 10 people, awesome. Okay, male reproductive system, you'll have a quiz that opens on Wednesday at noon, and a worksheet that was due today at noon, so I can get that back to you by Tuesday night, so you have it to study off of for your quiz. All right, and oh, last thing, Friday. I have an appointment on Friday, so I won't be able to have class with you on Friday, so I'm going to have a class on Thursday instead. So instead of Monday, Wednesday, Friday this week, it'll be Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, okay? Just so you're aware of that, and I'll put that in my update afterwards so you know that. Okay, let's start with the female reproductive system. So today we learn about girl parts. Last time we've been learning about boy parts, and again, you can ask me questions anytime about any of those things. And let's just move on to our female reproductive system. And I'll share that with you. And we will just go like so to the very beginning. Okay. I haven't put this up on Google Classroom yet. It should be up by 5 o'clock today. I have a couple of things I have to get done. But by 5 today, I should have this up. All right, so female reproductive system. So let's go through this and my little spotlight on. All right, everyone's good to go? Let's get started. Okay, so again, just some of the curricular outcomes that we're covering. So identify the structures in the human female reproductive system. Describe the functions. So the structures that we're responsible for knowing: the ovaries, fallopian tubes, uterus, endometrium, cervix, and vagina. So you've probably heard all of those words before, so we have to not only locate where they are on a diagram, but understand what their functions are as well. Distinguish the egg from the supporting structures. So we're going to be looking at some microscopic images, and we have to be able to determine the egg from the follicle and the follicular or granulosa cells. And then we have to understand what the corpus luteum is, and we'll get to that. Explain how sexually transmitted infections can interfere with fertility and reproduction. And then the hormone part, describe the role of hormones. So we'll notice some of the hormones are going to be the same as what they are with the male reproductive system. Gonadotropic releasing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. We've seen those ones before. Estrogen and progesterone will be the new ones we'll be learning about, as well as how they all work in the female system in the regulation of primary and secondary sex characteristics. And then identify principal reproductive hormones in the female and how they react or interact to lead to our menstrual cycle. So we'll go through all the details of the menstrual cycle as well. Okay, so before we do any of that, we need to label a diagram because we have to know where all these parts are. So let's just start at the bottom here. So we're going to kind of think about this as the pathway the sperm takes, okay? So the sperm takes the pathway. Remember, it's going through the male reproductive system. It's being produced in the testes. It's held in the epididymis until it becomes motile, and then it moves through the vas deferens, through the urethra, exits the male's body, and then enters the female's body here in the vagina, okay? And then from the vagina, the sperm's going to move through this band of tissue, okay? And this is a muscular band, and it's called the cervix, okay? Then from there, the sperm's going to move up into this space, which is about the size of a pear, and this is called the uterus, okay? And from there, the sperm's going to move through this structure, either on this side or this side, and those are referred to as the fallopian tubes, okay? All right, so now we get to a part that maybe you're not as familiar with. You've probably heard of all of these. You've done sex ed since grade 4. However, the fallopian tube is kind of weird because we kind of get this sense that it's attached to the ovaries. So when the egg leaves the ovaries, it goes right into the fallopian tubes. But really, the fallopian tubes, one end opens up into the uterus, but the other end has these finger-like projections that are called fimbria. Okay, so the ends of the fallopian tube is the fimbria. So what happens, imagine this hand is the ovary, and eggs leave in the ovary, and then the fimbria kind of just rubs over the ovary, but it's not attached. As the egg leaves, the fimbria collects the egg, and then it can pass through the fallopian tube. Okay, so the egg is going from the ovaries. Okay, so here's the 2 ovaries. The egg is traveling through the ovaries, captured by the fimbria, through the fallopian tube. Over here, the sperm has gone through the vagina, the cervix, the uterus, the sperm swimming through the fallopian tube, and then somewhere in here, the egg and the sperm come together and fertilization occurs. Okay? So fallopian tube is the site of fertilization. Okay, so what I have here is I've got a side diagram. Okay, so we're looking at a side cross-section or a lateral view cross-section. So this is her bum. The woman's facing this direction. And we're going to use the chat, and you're going to tell me what these body parts are that it's pointing to. So I will point to the part, and you in the chat are going to tell me this. And I have, how many of you today? 11 of you. So I should see lots of people putting their answers in the chat. Okay, so let's start with this line right here. What is this structure it's pointing at? Come on, guys, there is, how many of you? I think I said 11. 11 of you, what's this line? This structure, it's a little tube. I'll give you a hint. It starts with the letter V. There we go. Thank you, Grayson. Yes, this is the vagina. Now look at how teeny tiny it is. A 10-pound baby has to come through that structure at some point. Yes, it hurts like hell. Okay. So there's the vagina. Okay, so what is this structure? Thank you, Noah and Hans. Yes, this is the cervix, okay? So it's a band of tissue. Usually it's pretty tight together, okay? With just a tiny little space for the sperm to get through. So this is the cervix. Okay, this structure right here. So we're looking at this structure here. What are we looking at there? Okay, from the cervix, think about the pathway of the sperm. It enters the vagina, moves through the cervix. Thank you, Grayson. Yes, this is the uterus. So the uterus, when a woman's not pregnant, is the size of a pear, right? But eventually, when she gets pregnant, that uterus becomes quite large because it has to hold that 10-pound baby and all of the amniotic fluid and the placenta and all that stuff. Okay, now remember, there's two little holes in the side of the uterus. This is only because it's a lateral cross section. So we're looking at this tube here. So what tube is this? What are we talking about here? Awesome. So we're looking at the fallopian tube. Okay, so the fallopian tube ends in these little finger-like projections. And those little finger-like projections are called? Capture that egg that's been ovulated. Yes, the, oops, nope, no one wrote it yet. Finger-like projections. Fimbriae, yes. Okay, so, oops, I have the ovary first here. Fimbria. And then the ovary is right here. So remember, the ovary is not attached to the fallopian tube. Okay, so now we've got a couple other structures we need to look at as well. I'm just going to slide my chat up here. Oh, whoops, didn't want to. There we go. Slide that here. Okay, so now let's look at these structures here. So these aren't related to the reproductive system, but they certainly occur. So this is sort of in the front or anterior to the vagina. So what do you think this tube is? It's anterior to the vagina. Thank you, the urethra. Okay. And then this structure here. Awesome, the bladder. So if we just think about the female anatomy for a second, right? So we want to imagine our 10-pound baby is growing in this structure, but it's right next to the bladder. So it's no wonder that a woman who's pregnant ends up having to pee during the middle of the night because the capacity of that bladder becomes smaller and smaller as she becomes more and more pregnant, right? Or as the baby starts to grow inside of her. And the urethra in the female is quite a bit shorter than the urethra in the male. Remember, in the male, it's going the length of the penis plus further back over where the prostate is. In the female, it's quite short, which means the bacteria has more opportunity to move its way into the bladder. So women tend to be more prone to bladder infections than men. Okay, so now let's look here. So this is now posterior to the vagina, so towards the back of the body. So what's this structure here? The anus, exactly right. Perfect. Okay, so now we know the structures and we know where they are. So now we have to work a little bit on the functions of them. Okay, so the ovaries are the primary sex organs of the female. So remember, with the male, it's the testes. With the female, it's the ovaries. And remember, the fancy term for that is gonads. So our gonads. So again, we can take a look at this image and we can see the fimbria here at the end of the fallopian tubes, and we can see the ovaries, etc. Okay. All right. So the ovaries, what happens there? Well, what's there is eggs get produced there, and sex hormones for females get produced there. And the female sex hormones are estrogen and progesterone. So they get produced here in the ovaries. And we're going to have to know more detail than that. We're going to have to know where in the ovaries these things are happening. Okay. All right, the fallopian tubes. So this little image has just dyed them or colored them green so we can see them nicely. So one end of the fallopian tube has the fimbria, right? The finger-like projections. And the other end opens right into the uterus, okay? So remember, the sperm is going to move up here from the uterus and then into the fallopian tube where it'll meet with the egg for fertilization to occur. So the fimbriae, they're next to the ovaries, right? Not attached to, but adjacent to. When an egg is ovulated, so that means expelled from, so it kind of pushes against the side of the ovary, and it's collected by the fimbria, okay? All right. So the fallopian tubes are lined with cilia, and you probably remember learning about cilia last year with the reproductive system. So the cilia are these little hair-like structures that move along our respiratory tract, as an example, right? So when I get something a little further down my throat, the cilia will actually help pull it back up and move it up to the top where I can cough it out, or down towards the stomach where it can be digested if it's making its way, if we can force it towards the esophagus. Okay. So what the cilia does in the fallopian tube is it'll move that egg along, right? So the egg gets captured by the fimbria and it's in the fallopian tube. The cilia is going to move that egg along towards the uterus, okay? Because the egg is not motile. There's no ability for the egg to move on its own. Okay, we want to think about the fallopian tube as being the site of fertilization. So the sperm and egg combine in the fallopian tube for fertilization to occur. A couple things to take note of. An unfertilized egg will die about 24 hours after ovulation. So if a couple is trying to get pregnant, they need to do so within that 24-hour window, which means they need to know when the woman's ovulating. And there are some tests, and we'll talk about how to figure that out a little bit later. A fertilized egg takes about 3 to 4 days to reach the uterus. So somewhere in the fallopian tube is fertilized, and then that fertilized egg, as it's going towards the uterus, it's also dividing. And we'll talk about that when we get into our last booklet. Okay, so when we talk about fallopian tubes, we need to talk a little bit about female sterilization. Now, this method isn't used as much as vasectomy because this is a more invasive procedure. So like I told you guys, in the olden days, a woman who wanted to get tubal ligation had to get their entire abdominal wall cut. And anytime that happens, we're looking at about a 6-week recovery time. A vasectomy is an office procedure that can be done in 10 minutes. But now tubal ligation is not nearly as invasive. It's still invasive. It's a day surgery, and then you would still need about 3 days off of work. What they do is they make 2 incisions, one incision by your belly button, which is usually used for laparoscopic surgery. That's where they put the teeny tiny little cameras in. So we see the teeny tiny little camera here. And then the other incision is where they put the little tools, and they look through the camera and they can see the tools and do the surgery by actually looking at a screen, whatever's being projected by the camera. Okay. So what happens is there's a couple methods. It can be cauterized, so basically kind of melting or burning the 2 ends, tying or cut or banding it together. All of these things are going to prevent the sperm and the egg from meeting each other in the fallopian tube. And if they can't meet, then fertilization can't occur. Okay, so tubal ligation doesn't stop the woman from producing eggs or ovulating, but what it does is it prevents the sperm and the egg from meeting, so fertilization can't happen. All right. Okay, another thing to talk about as we're talking about fallopian tubes is something called an ectopic pregnancy. Now, an ectopic pregnancy is basically where that embryo becomes embedded in some place other than the uterus or the endometrial lining. So the embryo should become embedded in the uterus, but we can see there's lots of different sites, right? It can make its way here to the ovaries. It can be embedded up here on the outside. It can be bedded down here where the cervix is, here by where the fimbria is. So the vast majority of cases of ectopic pregnancies actually end up in the fallopian tube. Okay, so we can see here's an example of an ectopic pregnancy where that embryo is being embedded in the fallopian tube. Okay, this pregnancy will not go to completion, and there's a couple of reasons for that. So one of the reasons is the endometrium is what's built, right? That's what's got all the nutrients to support that developing embryo and then fetus. And the other issue that is with that is the uterus is meant to expand, right? It's meant to expand to that size for that 10-pound baby. The fallopian tube is not. And if this embryo here in the fallopian tube was expanding enough, it could actually cause that fallopian tube to burst and could end up causing a risk of fatality actually to the mother. So what a woman would feel is an incredible amount of pain, first of all, somewhere by where her ovaries are, lower down in her abdomen, and they would do surgery to remove the embryo. Okay, so the embryo won't actually grow into a baby. And what can happen is that fallopian tube can be damaged then to the point where it can't be used again for fertilization. Okay. All right, the uterus. So as I said before, the uterus is a pear-like shape, okay? And it's about the size of a pear for a human. So the fallopian tubes enter here at the top part of the ovary, right? So we want to remember there's these little tubes here, and whoops, missed my label for cervix here, whoops. But there's the uterus. We want to make sure we're able to identify this structure as being the uterus. Okay. All right, so the uterus has two different layers, the myometrium and the endometrium. Now, when we see this prefix myo, that's muscle, okay? So this is the muscle part of the uterus, and that's really important because when we're in labor, that muscle contracts and it helps to push that baby through the birth canal, okay? So that's the myometrium. It contracts during labor, and we'll talk later about the hormones that are required in order for that to occur, okay? So on the side here, we've labeled myometrium. So that's this nice, thick, muscular layer of the uterus, okay? Now the other layer of the uterus is called the endometrium. This is the one you would have learned about in sex ed as you were going through the older grades of elementary school. This is the inner layer of the uterus, okay? Now that inner layer of the uterus is glandular. So a lot of glands. It's richly supplied with blood vessels. So lots of blood vessels run through, and those blood vessels will build up as the woman's going through the latter stages of her menstrual cycle. And we'll talk about the hormones that control that. And that's important because it's there to support that developing embryo. And then if the woman's not pregnant, and we'll talk about the negative feedback mechanism for that, if she's not pregnant, then what happens is all of these blood vessels start to constrict. They're no longer connected, and then all of that excess blood sheds, okay? And that's when we go through or start our period, okay? The other thing we want to remember about the endometrium is that's the area where the embryo embeds. The embryo embeds in the endometrium of the uterus, okay? So the endometrium is the inner layer, and that's what I have labeled here. All right. Oh, we're good so far? Okay. Next, we have the cervix. All right. So the cervix, so we see the vagina down here. We see the uterus here. The cervix is this band of muscular tissue right here. So like I said, it's just a teeny tiny little hole, right? The sperm can get through the cervix. We go through parts of our cycle where we have more or less cervical discharge, which is discharge that's right here. And the consistency of that discharge is actually an indicator of how fertile we are. So you can read up about that, okay? So it's a muscular band that separates the vagina from the cervix. So part of what it's doing is it's helping to hold the baby in place. We have this muscle that's going to help hold the baby in place as the baby's developing throughout the pregnancy. It thins and dilates to allow the fetus to enter the birth canal. So before the push phase of the pregnancy, the uterus goes from being just like almost stuck together, that muscle, it actually dilates 10 centimeters. And that's when we get that signal to start to push. Okay. All right. The next slide, so just sort of stemming from this whole idea of the cervix, is a pap smear. Now, a pap smear is something that is important for women to get done. And just looking at the recommendations, it sounds like from about the age of 21. Now, this is something I'm not going to test you on, but it is something you need to know just for life, is what happens with a pap smear. So a pap smear is just a way for them to get a sample of cervical cells, okay? Because then it can test for irregularities in the cells. So what happens, first of all, is the woman would lay on the examining table in the doctor's office, okay? And the doctor inserts this metal device called a speculum inside of her vagina, okay? And then just opens it up a little bit, which expands the vagina out. And then this little, basically looks almost like a Q-tip, but it's really long. It can have a brush at the end or just a Q-tip end. And that goes through the speculum here that's allowed for expansion to take a sample of the cervical cells, okay? The cervical cells are then plated on a slide, and then the doctor sprays this fixant on it that basically fixes the cells in place. That slide goes to be tested, and those cells get looked at underneath the microscope. And if there's irregularities in those cells, then they would take another sample and they would test to make sure that the woman doesn't have cervical cancer. So I had a friend who had this done, and they found irregular cells. And so 6 months later, they did it again, found irregular cells. And then eventually, I think she went through this for about 1.5 years. And then eventually they found cervical cancer cells. And she ended up having a hysterectomy, which is the removal of the uterus in order to remove the cervix and any potential cancer. Okay. So this is a test for precancerous or cancerous cells. Most doctors recommend this after the age of 21, once every 2 to 3 years. Now, the biggest indicator of cervical cancer, the biggest risk factor rather of cervical cancer is an HPV infection, which is human papillomavirus or genital warts. Okay. So once you become sexually active and you reach the age of 21, that's usually when doctors will recommend having this procedure done, okay? And it just happens in the doctor's office. All right, the vagina. So the vagina is what connects the uterus to the outside of the body. So it's the site of sexual intercourse, right? So then the semen is going to end up here, move its way through the cervix, the uterus, and then to the fallopian tube for fertilization. But it's also the birth canal, so that's where the baby comes through to get to the outside of the body. The vagina is very acidic, so it's got a fairly low pH, hovering around a pH of about 4. And what this does is inhibits most microbial growth, except for the natural flora that's meant to grow there. Okay, so other bacteria don't tend to grow there, just the natural flora, because it's a very specific condition for those bacteria to grow. One thing that can happen is women who are on antibiotics, they can end up, those antibiotics sometimes aren't very bacteria specific, right? So it can kill some of the bacteria that naturally are supposed to grow there. And what that does is the bacteria, when its concentration is high, and these are the good bacteria, what it does is it keeps that yeast population low. But the antibiotics can sometimes reduce that bacteria population. It doesn't compete very well then with the yeast, but the yeast population goes up. So some women, not all women, but some women who take antibiotics end up having a yeast infection as a result of that. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about oogenesis. So oogenesis we learned about way back in February when we did cell division. We talked about the division to create eggs. So this is a form of meiosis. So it's the production of ova, which is a fancy word for egg cells. Oocytes are the precursors to that. They're found in our ovaries. They divide through meiosis to produce a mature oocyte or an ovum. Now, in the male reproductive system, we talked about Sertoli cells as being the cells that offer nourishment to help with the development of that sperm. The female has granulosa cells. Some resources refer to them as follicular cells, and these help with the development of those developing oocytes. Okay, so they provide nutrients for the oocytes. A follicle is like a sac, and that follicle has a single oocyte surrounded by a whole lot of granulosa cells. Different stages of development, the follicle will actually get bigger and bigger. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at this image here. Again, a scanning electron micrograph, which is so cool because we see this really big three-dimensional image. So what we're looking at here, this is the oocyte. Oocytes are actually the largest cells of the human body. We can actually see these with our naked eye. Sperm, you can't, they're teeny tiny. Now, what we're looking at here surrounding the oocyte are granulosa cells, okay? So those are the support cells. Okay, so with this image here, we're looking at a microscopic image of a cross-section of the ovaries. So what I've done is just highlighted a couple things. So if I look here, I've highlighted in black. What I'm looking at here, all of these are follicles. Okay, so everything that's in black is referred to as a follicle. So all of these little circles here are follicles. They're really immature follicles, so they really don't have much for granulosa cells at all. Okay, so those are follicles. What I'm looking at here, this is an oocyte. Okay, so the oocyte, and then we have these granulosa cells, which we see this dark purple color that are surrounding the oocyte. Okay, so these would be all teeny tiny little cells, where this is one great big giant cell. Okay, so let's look at a couple other viewpoints of this. I'm not sure if my animation is very good for all. Oh, see, I missed something from animation. Okay, so this is referring to all the black, those are follicles. Okay, so remember, follicles are this sac. Follicles have granulosa cells and the oocyte. Okay, so what's in black are the follicles. Now the blue here, those are the oocytes. Okay, and what I'm seeing is different developments of the follicles. Okay, what I'm pointing out with the green here, these are all granulosa cells. So if I look at this cell here, I've got a thin layer of granulosa cells around the oocyte. If I look at this cell, it's a little bit further along. This has more granulosa cells around the oocyte. What happens as we get closer and closer to ovulation, the follicle gets bigger, so there's more granulosa cells, and then eventually what happens is we end up with fluid inside. So what I'm looking at, oh, I have white, I don't want white. Let's color this with dark red. What I'm looking at here, all of this is actually fluid. I know it's dye, the crystals somehow take on some of the dye, but this is fluid. So as it gets closer and closer to ovulation, there actually ends up being fluid inside that follicle as well. Okay, so this is a whole entire follicle. Let's just go on to that. Okay, so we have our whole entire follicle. We have all of these granulosa cells. So they're teeny tiny. So we're not actually seeing individual cells in this image, but there's a whole lot of teeny tiny little granulosa cells here. We have the oocyte here, and then we have a large amount of fluid here. So we know that this is getting closer to the point of ovulation. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at this one. And again, my animation's maybe not perfect. Okay, so now what I'm looking at here, This one's getting really close to ovulation because I have lots of fluid in it. So everything that I've circled, those are all follicles, okay? So these are our follicles. Now, I should have little blue circles here because those are all oocytes. That little black dot in the middle is actually the nucleus, right? That's the nucleus of the oocyte, that little dark, not black, but dark pink. Here's the nucleus here of the oocyte. So this whole thing is an oocyte, okay? And then what I'm looking at, all of these, so now we can see the size of these cells a little bit better. So we can see how these cells are teeny tiny. See how the granulosa cells are surrounding the oocyte? They're on the innermost layer here of the follicle. And then what we can notice with this is this, and I'm just going to outline it in this red pen. That's the fluid, right? So this bigger amount of fluid. So eventually this is going to push against the wall of the ovary and that oocyte is going to be released, okay? All right, so now we'll take a look at this one. I don't think I put any animation on this one, I'm pretty sure. No, I didn't. Okay, so let's take a look here. So when a woman's ovaries, what happens is there's going to be a whole lot of different stages of follicles on one set of ovaries, okay? Because each follicle, every month about 1,000 follicles start to develop. Only one of them actually ends up being ovulated. So that's why every month we're going to have these massive different stages of follicles within the ovary, and then one ovulates. And then the next month, 1,000 more start development, only one ends up developing. So let's take a look here. And I'm just going to use different colored pens, and we're going to talk about what I have circled. So what has Mrs. McRae circled? That's our new little game here. Okay. All right. So let's color with black to start with. Okay. So what is, oh, I guess I need my draw function on. What is this structure that I have circled? What have I just circled there? What would I call that structure? I have 10 of you guys. Okay, looking at this structure right here. What would I call that entire structure? All right, I will help you out. This is a follicle, okay? If I look over here, this is a follicle. So remember, a follicle is a sac. Now what we're looking at here is a two-dimensional image, right? It's a cross section. But we want to imagine we have these sacs that are filled with granulosa cells, and somewhere in the middle of the sac is an oocyte, right? This is a follicle. A follicle, a follicle, a follicle. That's a follicle there. Okay, so all of these are follicles. And then over here, we've got these little tiny, whoops, not really, okay, I'm doing a crappy job of circling these, but these are little tiny follicles, okay? They have almost no granulosa cells, a tiny little outer edge of granulosa cells, that's it, okay? And then if I change my color here and we'll use blue, this is an oocyte. This is an oocyte. This is an oocyte. So this big pink circle in the middle, that's an oocyte. Okay. Now this one here, let's highlight it with a spotlight. This follicle here, this is my most advanced follicle out of all the other ones that are in the picture. Okay. And I can tell that for two reasons. So there's two reasons that tell me it's more mature. One of the reasons is it's bigger. And the other reason is I can see inside of this, there is a whole lot of fluid. Okay, so I'll just outline in red, right? This is the stuff that doesn't take the purple dye. It kind of has a pinky color, but this is all fluid, and the more fluid there is, the closer it is to ovulation. Okay, all right. Any questions about that? So we need to know the difference between where the follicle is and the granulosa cells, and we should be able to tell what is a more mature follicle versus a less mature follicle. Okay, and then all of these little purple dots, each one of those is a cell. So each one of those is a granulosa cell. So we see the granulosa cell, it becomes more mature, surround the oocyte, and then are on the outer edges of the follicle. Okay, all right. Let's move on here. Okay, let's get rid of this. Now I know my animation for this didn't work all that great, but let's do our best here. So what we're looking at is this whole idea of ovulation. Okay, so the first thing I want to do, there, move these to the downward position here for now. What I've done in blue, and I meant to do that with this little guy here too, but what I've done in blue here is highlighted the follicles. So each of these structures is a follicle, but we see that as we're going from the top to this one here, we have increasing maturity of these follicles. Okay, this has almost no granulosa cells, and then as we go closer and closer to this point, we have more and more granulosa cells. Okay, all right, so now what I've highlighted in green here, all of these are oocytes. Okay, so here I see the oocyte, almost no granulosa cells, lots of granulosa cells, thicker layer of granulosa cells, more granulosa cells, but now I've got some fluid, even more granulosa cells. Except, look what happened here. From this point to this point, meiosis 1 has happened. And now in red here, I've highlighted the first polar body. So remember what happens when oogenesis occurs. We have this non-symmetrical cytokinesis that happens. So we start with our primary oocyte. One side gets all the cytoplasm, and in humans, 23 chromosomes. The other side gets almost no cytoplasm and 23 chromosomes. That's the polar body. But there's just not enough cytoplasm for this to survive. The polar body dies. This secondary oocyte, this gets ovulated. Okay, so all of this that we're looking at right here, this is all in the ovary. Then that secondary oocyte is ovulated. Okay. All right, so now when I look down here, it's being ovulated. Well, where is it going? It's going to the fallopian tubes. But look, I've got all these little cells on the outside of this secondary oocyte. The ones without tails are granulosa cells. The ones with tails are sperm. So that secondary oocyte is ovulated. It makes its way into the fallopian tube. If it's fertilized, meiosis 2 will happen. Meiosis 2, we get the mature ovum and the second polar body. If fertilization doesn't happen, meiosis 2 doesn't happen. Okay? Great. Okay, it's 2:45, so we are going to stop there. So remember, nervous system unit test is posted. Male reproductive system was to do today at noon, so make sure you get it done because I'd like to get it back to you late tomorrow night because then you have it to study for Wednesday. Wednesday, you have a male reproduction quiz. Okay? There's no worksheet on the female reproductive system. I'll make one up for you probably for the end of Wednesday's class. And remember, no Friday class, Thursday instead. Any questions for me? Okay, without seeing any questions, I will say goodbye. Have yourselves a wonderful day, and we will see you on Wednesday. And I see I have a chat here. See you, Noah. I hope everything's going well. You're welcome, Abby.